Shlam alochon, everybody. Shlam alochon is hello in Assyrian, so good morning. And I want to say thank you for joining us today for our second day, Genocide Awareness Week. I'm so delighted to be here. And I hope you've all had as much coffee as I have. So if I go a little fast, you know why. I've had 2 cups already. Today, I will be presenting Dr. Anahit Khosroeva, but a little bit about myself. And I apologize, some of you were here yesterday, so if this sounds redundant, I truly apologize. My name is Ramina Jaju-Frindrich. I am a rheumatologist by training and a 3rd-generation genocide survivor, and the president of Assyrian Genocide Research Center in Arizona chapter. I also serve on the Community Advisory Board for GAW at ASU. GAW seeks to confront violent actions and ongoing threats of genocides throughout the world. And we look to the past to get guidance for the future. And we're deeply thankful to Rosenbluth Family Charitable Foundation as a sponsor of GAW 10th. This lecture is also sponsored by Assyrian American Cultural Organization of Arizona and Assyrian Student Association of Arizona. So some of you may ask, who are Assyrians? Assyrians are the indigenous people of the Middle East, whose empire was known as the cradle of civilization. In fact, we just celebrated our new year, 6,772 last week. They've been subject to multiple acts of genocide in their ancestral homeland, which spans over Iraq, Iran, and Syria, as well as Turkey. The most notable was the genocide of 1915 to 1923 during the reign of Ottoman Turkey, when 2/3 of the Assyrian population was decimated. My paternal grandparents lost over 20 members of their family during this mass persecution, and this is why I'm very interested and grateful for Genocide Awareness Week. That being said, Dr. Anahit Khosroeva is an Assyrian human rights defender and genocide scholar born in Armenia. She's a leading researcher at the Department of Armenian Genocide Studies in the Institute of History, Armenian National Academy of Sciences. Dr. Khosroeva is the author of a dozen research books and monographs, as well as numerous articles on the history of the Armenian, Assyrian, Greek genocides during the Ottoman period. Her research interests include comparative genocide studies and human rights. She has presented at various worldwide academic and political conferences. On March 24th, 2015, with her continuous efforts, a month before the commemoration of the centennial of the Armenian Genocide, the National Assembly of the Republic of Armenia unanimously passed a resolution recognizing the Greek and Assyrian genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire. For her outstanding services, Dr. Khosroeva has received numerous awards and state medals. Today, she continues to be an active voice in bringing further awareness, recognition, and justice for Assyrians and Armenians using international human rights. Her presentation today is an overview, the Assyrian Genocide, historical overview and analysis. Dr. Khosroeva, welcome.
Dr. Ramina, thank you so much for your beautiful introduction, and thank you so much for being here. Before starting, I would like to take a couple seconds and say thank you for Arizona State University, Professor Lifton and whole staff for organizing for 10 years in a row the Genocide Awareness Week. And before we were speaking with Professor Lifton, and I said, I'm saying this one not on behalf of Assyrians, but also Armenians and country of Armenia. That's very, very thoughtful, and we are really grateful for this. Also, I would like to thank all Assyrian organizations, co-sponsors of this event, for us being here. I'm humbled and I'm honored. Thank you so much. So the topic of my presentation today, I'm going to use a PowerPoint, so it will be easy for you. It's the Assyrian Genocide. Of course, there are too many things to speak about this, but I'm going to be like very, very short and to speak about the most significant parts of our genocide. And I'm going to go through historical overview, and at the end, maybe we will do some analysis. And if you have any questions, I will be very happy to answer. So the Assyrian Genocide, along with Armenian and Greek genocides, was the first intent ethnic cleansing and mass extermination of the 20th century, which occurred in the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. Hundreds of thousands Assyrians perished as the result of execution, deportation, starvation, diseases, the harsh environment, and physical abuse. The systematic manner in which the massacres and slaughters of Assyrians was conducted, along with the documented intentions of Turkish leaders and sheer number of individuals murdered, demonstrate that the Turkish government planned and to a great extent succeeded in fulfilling a policy of genocide toward the Assyrian people. With the criminal connivance of the world's major powers and taking the opportunity presented by the martial law, Turkey committed the gravest crime against humanity, genocide. The First World War was an ideal context in which Ottoman state could accomplish this goal. The war not only observed the recourses and focus of the world's major powers, but it also created a morally ambiguous atmosphere where brutality and death on a massive scale could be justified or trivialized. The Assyrians, whose Christian identity and cultural durability were perceived by Turkish nationalists to be undesirable obstacles to the realization of pan-Turkic nation, found themselves bearers of a misfortune with reverberations lasting to this very day. The professional, The professional investigation of the anatomy of the Ottoman Empire by a lot of worldwide scholars let us deduce that the latter bore crime and genocide and topologically could be categorized as a genocidal state. The Ottoman state system, with inclination to slaughters and genocide, has provided itself with an adequate concept, a theoretical foundation for the preparation and perpetration of, in our case, the Assyrian Genocide. Let us see what was the cause of Assyrian genocide in the Ottoman Empire, and could it be or would it be possible to avoid it? What are the consequences of more than a century-long not recognition and denial of the Assyrian genocide? Certainly the Armenian and Greek genocides along with it by today's Republic of Turkey, the successor of the Ottoman Empire. The International Association of Genocide Scholars in 2007 reached a common understanding that the Ottoman campaign against Christian minorities of the Ottoman Empire between 1914 and 1923 constituted genocide against Armenians, Assyrians, and Pontian and Anatolian Greeks. The president of the Genocide Watch encouraged the denial by world's leading genocide scholars of the Turkish government, by that time 92-year denial of the Ottoman Empire's genocides against its Christian population, including Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks. The dissolution of the Ottoman Empire is in both historiography and public memory, almost solely associated with the murder of the Armenians. Although the Turkish government still denies that the Armenian population of the Ottoman Empire fell a victim to systematic murder, the extermination of Armenians is far from being a forgotten genocide. No book on the history of genocide can omit case of the Armenians. It counts as the first modern genocide, which was presently understood by much of the world to have been the climax of a long history of oppression and violence for a group that had suffered for centuries as a Christian minority at the hands of the Turks. Unfortunately, achieving the global remembrance of the genocide against Armenians seems to have downplayed the fate of all other Christian minority groups in the Ottoman Empire, such as Assyrians and Greeks, that suffered from ethnic cleansing and mass murder at the hands of the Sultan Abdul Hamid II and the Young Turks. Henry Morgenthau, who served as US ambassador in Constantinople until 1916, stated in his memoirs, quoting, "The Armenians are not the only subject people in Turkey which have suffered from this policy of making Turkey exclusively the country of the Turks. The story which I have told about the Armenians, I could also tell with certain modifications about the Greeks and the Assyrians." Nevertheless, the suffering of the Assyrians is largely forgotten internationally and not recognized as genocide, which embitters the descendants of the victims. This ancient civilized nation faced the menace of total physical extermination in the name of bringing about the dream of the Young Turks to create a pure Turkish state. The genocidal quality of a murderous campaign against not only the Armenians, but also Assyrians is obvious. Historians who realized that the Young Turks' extermination policies against Armenians, Assyrians, and Greeks have to be analyzed together and understood as an entity are therefore often tempted to speak of a Christian genocide. The destruction of these free Christian communities was one aspect of the homogenizing process when a modern state with destructive power out of ideological radicalization identified part of its own civilians as undesirable. The Assyrian genocide occurred in the same circumstances as the Armenian genocide. It was part of the same process, taking place in the same locations and at the same time as the Armenian genocide. At the turn of the 20th century, the Assyrian people in the Ottoman Empire amounted to be about 1 million with common language, culture, and national traditions. They were concentrated in the territory of modern Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Like other Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, Assyrians were treated as second-class citizens. Slavery was the fate of some Ottoman Christians. Many Assyrians studied in Turkish educational institutions, but after getting their diplomas or certificates, found that no opportunities for employment in public positions or authority. They didn't have even an opportunity to economically develop their regions. Turkish authorities restricted where the Assyrians lived so that they couldn't form a majority among the other nations with whom they lived. This was done in order to deprive them of the possibility of putting up a united front. An active public policy was conducted to arouse national and religious animosity among the nations inhabiting those territories. The history of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, and particularly of its last decade, is one of the increasing internal weakness and deterioration in the machinery of government and of sustained external pressure by the great powers, which ultimately lead to the dissolution of the empire. Violence directed against Assyrians and Armenians at the end of the 19th century marked the beginning of the development of a state genocidal program. The first anti-Assyrian programs of a genocidal nature appeared in the middle of the last decade of the 19th century, 1894-1896. This violence directed and perpetrated against unarmed people in the peacetime marked the beginning of a development of state genocidal program. It was organized by Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who exercised one-man rule, and important political decisions were made by him alone. Its implementation ended a mass killing of the Assyrian population of the Ottoman Empire, whose victims totaled 55,000. The genocidal nature of Sultan Abdul Hamid's anti-Assyrian policy is beyond any doubt. Several of the circumstances from which international criminal tribunals judges infer genocide were present: mass killings, large-scale rapes, destruction of villages and religious sites, and deportation of civilians. Assyrian villages and towns were sacked by organized mobs or by Kurdish bands. The bloodshed and destruction gained a fearsome momentum. Tens of thousands were driven from their homes. About 100,000 Assyrians of 245 villages were forcibly converted to Islam. Their property was plundered. All possessions, such as gold, silver, money, were confiscated. Thousands of Assyrians, men, women, children, and all people were brutally assassinated. The Assyrian women and girls were forced into Turkish and Kurdish households. The slaughters were perpetrated as barbarously as possible, regardless of gender or age. Thus, atrocity became a policy. On June 2nd of 1895, the American New York Times reported, "We have the unanimous verdict of the native Christians of Turkey, Armenians, Assyrians, Greeks, that the Sultan is personally responsible not only because he gave direct orders that men, women, and children should be tortured, outraged, and murdered, but because for years past, he persistently followed a course that would infallibly end in just such a condition of things as the present." The Hamidian massacres revealed most of all the breakdown of a traditional Ottoman paternalistic system in which status was assigned and minorities were tolerated. Conservative Turks supportive of a regime were given complete license at the discretion of the monarch to victimize at will a population targeted for mistreatment. The tyranny of the Sultan worsened this dynamic of the Ottoman system. Victimization through atrocities was adopted as a method of government, as an instrument of repression, and as an acceptable policy in the treatment of a subject population. Sultan Abdul Hamid harbored a pathological hatred of the Christians, in our case, Assyrians, and instituted policies that set precedents for the events that would unfold during World War I. These slaughters were the result not simply of irrational hatred, but the anxiety within ruling circles and large segments of Ottoman society over the empire's seemingly irreversible decline. The empire didn't, however, simply crumble of its own accord. This was the age of European expansion and imperialism, and England and Russia and other great powers hastened to profit from Ottoman weakness. Now, Speaking about the Ottoman atrocities of Christians in the empire during this period, it's only in 19th century, I'd like to mention about this brotherly connection, solidarity, and support of the Assyrians and Armenians toward each other those days. When in October of 1895, the massacres of Assyrians began, according to the Armenian eyewitness, the Assyrian Orthodox Church of the Virgin Mary in Amida or Tigranakert or Diyarbakir gave refuge to many Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks. Here, a revealing exchange occurred when the Assyrians suggested to their priest that the Armenian refugees be expelled from the building so as not to aggravate Turkish sentiment. The Assyrian priest replied, "The people who cross themselves will stay in church to the end. Should we be killed, we will be killed together." At the end, the church was destroyed completely and all people were killed by the Turks and Kurds. 119 villages in Diyarbakir were scorched and ruined. 6,000 Christian families, about 30,000 people were killed in this area. And this is only one example I am bringing here. In Armenian National Archives, there are dozens of these types of documents regarding the solidarity of Assyrians and Armenians during this difficult time. So, the Ottoman Empire entered the 20th century as a backward dictatorial state, which organized mass massacres and slaughters of the diverse nations living in the empire. The crisis, which involved the political, economic, and social systems, still deepened. The massacres exacerbated the situation and bared the vices of the Ottoman state. In the eyes of all the peoples of the empire, even in the eyes of the Turkish people, Sultan Abdul Hamid was an odious person, the symbol of their misfortunes, violence, and torture. The idea of riddance of a bloodthirsty sultan was growing and maturing. The dismal state of affairs, exemplified by the outmoded style and policies of the erratic sultan, inevitably provoked opposition. The Young Turks, university and military students and cadets who advocated modernization and reform, the Committee of Union and Progress, the major Young Turks organization, was formed. The Committee of Union and Progress was a politically heterogeneous group that was united in its desire for political and social reform and modernization. As was true of many revolutionary movements, the Committee of Union and Progress contained democratic and progressive, as well as autocratic and repressive elements. The more democratic faction was inclined to address inequalities among groups within the empire, while the other were fiercely nationalistic and explicitly hostile toward Armenians and other minorities. The Young Turks gained widespread support among educated elites and perhaps most importantly within the military, and they took power in a largely peaceful revolution in July of 1908. Sultan Abdul Hamid stepped aside, retaining only meaningless title, and was pushed out completely in 1909 after a failed counter-revolution. When the Young Turks Party Union and Progress organized a revolt and seized the power, all the people of the empire, Muslims or Christians, vigorously welcomed the overthrow of a bloodthirsty sultan. They hoped it was dawning of a new age in the history of the Ottoman Empire. But as appeared shortly after, The Young Turks were ardent nationalists who continued the policy of oppression and slaughters carried out prior to them by sultans. They were advocates of the idea of assimilation of all the peoples of the empire to create a pure Turkish nation, never stopping before mass killings in order to execute that idea. The Young Turks sought the Turkification of all society. To mobilize and radicalize the people, the party established ultranationalist groups such as the Paramilitary Association for the Promotion of Turkish Strength, whose principal goal was to train the youth so that Turkey could again be a warrior nation. The regime began issuing violent threats against the Christian community, which was rapidly abandoning the hopes it had placed in the Young Turk Revolution only a few years earlier. How could a political vanguard that advocated democracy, fraternity, and equal rights in 1908 make such a hostile decision in 1910 at the annual Young Turks Congress at Saloniki, Greece, where the secret discussion outside the formal sitting revolved around a plan for the coercive homogenization of Turkey, euphemistically called the complete Ottomanization of all Turkish subject. British Ambassador Lothar observed that to them, Ottoman evidently means Turk, and their present policy of Ottomanization is one of the pounding the non-Turkish elements in a Turkish mortar. Thus, the radical wing of the Young Turks didn't limit its ambitions to governing a multinational Ottoman state. It espoused a complete ideology which envisioned the remarking of the Ottoman Empire into an exclusively Turkish nation. The Young Turks intended to transform the pluralistic Ottoman Empire into an ethically, religiously homogeneous national state. Christians couldn't have an equal part in such a new society. The ambitions of the Young Turks, however, extended beyond this primary goal. According to Taner Akçam, the Committee of Union and Progress has formulated, prior to the First World War, a policy that they began to execute in the Aegean region against the Greeks, and during the war years expanded to include the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, the Syrians, and especially the Armenians, a policy that eventually became a genocidal. Detailed reports were prepared outlining the elimination of the Christian population. Britain, France, and Russia initially defined Ottoman atrocities against minorities as crimes against Christianity, but later substituted humanity after considering the negative reaction that such a specific term could elicit from Muslims in their colonies. During one of the secret meetings, the Young Turk ideologist Dr. Nazim said, "The massacre is necessary. I want Turks and only Turks to live on this soil and to be in full possession of it. The hell with all the non-Turkish elements, no matter what their nationality or religious is." According to German missionary and humanist Dr. Johannes Lepsius, the Young Turk Party's program stated, "Sooner or later, all the nations under Turkish control will be turned into Turks. It is clear that they will not convert voluntarily and we will have to use force." The Young Turks wouldn't wait for circumstances to define their policy. They would seek the opportunity to proceed with their plans. That occasion offered itself sooner than expected in 1914, when Europe plunged into World War I and the Young Turks triumvirate. Minister of the Interior Talat, Minister of the War Enver, and Minister of the Navy Cemal, who had been governing the Ottoman Empire since 1913, secretly and eagerly brought their country into the Great War. During a talk with Dr. Mortman, an employee of the German embassy, Talat Pasha said that exploiting the opportunity of martial law, the Turkish government would eventually get rid of its internal enemies, the Christians, without fear or foreign diplomatic intervention. Dr. Behaeddin Shakir, executive committee member of the Committee of Union and Progress, almost said the same thing. We are in war. There is no danger of European intervention. The world press cannot protest. And even if they do, I'm sure there's there, so you can read it. So even they will do, they will not dare to have their voice. So, and it will be, we will be have the circumstances since they will not present themselves again. So as we can see, the figures changed, new rulers came, but the policy persisted. Also, the problem of minorities, racial and religious, had been to a large extent solved by the simple method of extermination. The Young Turks' overall aim was a demographic reorganization of the Ottoman Empire. The ruling Committee of Union and Progress Party decided on an extreme solution, the wholesale deportation of all Armenians and Assyrians to the Syrian desert, which in reality meant mass murder. All deportations were planned and supervised by the Directorate for the Settlement of Tribes and Immigrants that, I'm having some trouble here. Okay, I'm so sorry for that. Yeah, Directorate for Settlement of Tribes and Immigrants that belonged to the Ottoman Ministry of the Interior. The deportation began with scattered removals in February of 1915 and gathered speed in March after the Young Turks dismissed the Ottoman parliament, silencing a possible source of opposition to their plans. Christian communities were uprooted on a vast scale beginning in late May with a deportation law issued as a temporary emergency decree by the Young Turks. It was published in the government newspaper and posted in public areas. The law gave government authority to deport the entire population of towns, villages, and rural areas where inhabitants were suspected of engaged in espionage or sedition, if necessary by force. The task of carrying out of the order to members of the Turkish police called Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, so who were gendarmes, and many of them, they were recruited especially for the job by the special organization, the secret police force responsible for organizing the deportation. According to contemporary accounts, some of these gendarmes were hardened criminals who had been released from prison for this very reason. On June 30th of 1915, the American consul in Harput province, Leslie Davis, wrote to Ambassador Henry Morgenthau in Constantinople that it was publicly announced that all the Armenians and Assyrians have to leave during 5 days. The forced deportation was in every sense a death march. When the elderly or the weak fell or took a rest, the gendarmes would promptly finish them off with rifle shot or more commonly a sword strike or clubbing. Usually the people on the march were denied food or water. By the time most of the refugees reached their final destination, if they made it that far, they were certainly ill and in a grave danger of dying due to starvation, dehydration, sickness, and exposure. Often due to lack of foodstuff, people were forced by hunger to eat grass, dead animals that had died from exposure, and even grains out of animal dung as food. In many places, the gendarmes began by murdering young and middle-aged male population who might have tried to resist. Now I am going to quote again here the American consul, Leslie Davis, who wrote to Ambassador Morgenthau those days regarding the above-mentioned subject. The system that is being followed seems to be to have bands of Kurds awaiting them on the road to kill the men, especially and incidentally some of the others. The entire movement seems to be the most thoroughly organized and effective massacre this country has ever seen. In some places, the men were separated out from marching columns of deportees and executed in front of their family relatives. After the loss of their male protectors, women and girls were easy prey to physical abuse, including rape and murder. Next slide is on the Assyrian female survivor who recounted witnessing her father's execution. So you can read by yourself, and I'm just going to continue because of the lack of time. There are thousands and thousands of a similar kind of stories of the Assyrian survivors who went through that nightmare. And regarding this, the American missionary in Urfa, Leslie, wrote to United States Consul in Aleppo, Jackson, relating stories heard from deportees, as well as his own eyewitness testimony. Later, he recorded in his official report for the State Department. Again, I'm gonna leave it as this so you can live by yourself. So I'm just gonna skip that part. Now, quick, I wanna speak about the Ottoman documents on Assyrians, which is again very important. There are plenty of Ottoman documents on Armenians, but on Assyrians, we are, of course, lack of it. And right now I'm going to show you, but it's very important and important topic to speak. So I'm just going to show you only 5 documents from about Assyrian deportations, and there is a translations there in English. So the following 5 documents from the Ottoman archives. All documents are telegrams sent from the Ministry of the Interior of the government of Ittihad ve Teraki, or Committee of Union and Progress, or the Young Turks. The telegrams are sent to the governors in the province of Van, Diyarbakir, Mosul, Halep, and Bitlis. The documents show that all Assyrian denomination, be it Nestorian, Chaldean, or Syriac Orthodox or Catholic, have been affected by the turmoil of deportation. Although the telegrams make no mention of massacres, the last telegram, I believe it should be number 5, I'm getting there, many villages around Mardin, Midyat, and Diyarbakir were empty. By the way, the map of Mardin, Midyat, and Diyarbakir, I'm going to show you later on. I'm going to speak about it, but no doubt, these villages were once populated by Assyrians. I think this is the document I was speaking about. So the Young Turks government, having caused evacuation of the villages through physical elimination and then sought to repopulate villages with Turks from the Balkans, inevitably altering the ethnic makeup of a region. During the First World War, on the territory of the Ottoman Empire, the atrocities of the Assyrians were perpetrated with unspeakable brutality. All possible methods of killing were used: shooting, stabbing, stoning, crushing, throat cutting, throwing off of roofs, drowning, and decapitation. It is absolutely impossible to read the multiple trustworthy documents describing those atrocities and remain apathetic or indifferent. Turkish armed forces slaughtered Assyrians in the region of Turabdin beginning on June 5, 1915, where 10,000 Assyrians were murdered. One document reads, "The skulls of small children were smashed with rocks. The bodies of girls and women who resisted rape or conversion to Islam were chopped into pieces. Men were mostly beheaded or thrown into the nearby river. The clergy, monks, and nuns were skinned or burned alive." The governor of Diyarbakir, Rashid Bey, directed the earliest anti-Christian extermination projects in the regions. The Assyrians of the Mardin, Midyat, Urfa, and Jazire, and this is the map which I was talking about, were especially victimized. The most brutal slaughters of many thousands of Assyrians were perpetrated. Through various companions, there is written evidence of massacres and attacks against Assyrians in 178 small towns and villages in Diyarbakir province and its nearest neighboring regions only in 1915. The priest of the local Assyrians in the province of Diyarbakir, Reverend Joseph Naim, reported that massacres in this region had taken place since April 8, 1915. The culprits gathered men over 16 years of age, beat, tortured, killed them, and afterwards put turbans on their heads and photographed them in order to prove to the world that Christians were oppressing Muslims, not vice versa. Assyrians also suffered in the province of Van, where the governor Jevdet Bey had a butcher regiment of 8,000 men that carried out unprecedented massacres. 60 Assyrian villages in Van had been subjected to atrocities. One striking example was the terrible slaughter in the Hakkari region in spring of 1915, where Turks murdered approximately 60,000 Assyrians. The village of Kochanis, which was the residence of the Assyrian patriarch, was completely destroyed that time. Dr. Johannes Lepsius, German Protestant missionary, was an eyewitness how Turks hang lots of innocent Assyrians at the gates of the city of Van, in one of the central streets of the town. When some of them tried to protect themselves and fight back, they all were arrested and killed. Dr. Johannes Lepsius, in his future memories, was writing, "I wish I could erase that horrible image from my memory of those terrible days and could keep silent about that horrific tragedy of Assyrians." In June 1915, the armies of Jevdet Bey and General Halil Bey organized a general massacre in the province of Bitlis, which lasted throughout the month. 1,000 Assyrians were mercilessly killed in their houses and on the streets. Already in 1916, while the crime was still in progress, a valuable volume of documents were prepared by Viscount James Bryce and Oxford historian Arnold Toynbee and published by the British Parliament. In one of its chapters, this blue book described how Jevdet Bey entered the regions of Bohtan, Bitlis, and Sagert and massacred the Assyrian population. Plus, when Christian society was completely paralyzed, the government issued the deportation edicts. Throughout the spring and summer of 1915, across the length and breadth of the Ottoman Empire, Assyrians and Armenians were ordered to prepare themselves for removal from their homes. Their destination was unknown. With only few days' notice, in most places, the entire villages and towns were deported. Thousands upon thousands were set upon the roads, forced to abandon homes and belongings. Within days and weeks, travel for the deportees turned into a taste of physical strength and of a will to survive. Whole families, young and old, children and women, were thrown into the open to walk by day and sleep on the ground by night. Families began wither from exhaustion, which was the slowest way to die. Weakening day by day, with resources running out, tens of thousands perished silently as their bodies were reduced to skin and bones. Countless people died of thirst. The cry of children for food drove some mothers out of their minds. Some of the young girls were taken as servant girls. Others were seized as unwilling brides. Women preferred to drown themselves in rivers than go that far. Isaac Yonan, the Assyrian man who had been miraculously saved after this deportation, was writing in his future memories that the situation was so unbearable, it seemed that those who alive envied the dead. Assyrians endured massacres not only inside the Ottoman realm, but on its periphery as well. The destruction of Assyrian villages accompanied German and Turkish military operations in Iran, which the two allies intended to use as a corridor to the oil regions of Baku and thereafter to invade Central Asia. Iran thus became a battleground on which acts of mass violence were perpetrated against undesirable elements through the country was keeping its neutrality during the First World War. An Iranian official in Urmia reported in October 1914 that the message of holy war against Christians on behalf of the Ottoman state had spread among the tribes of the Ottoman-Iranian border. 70,000 Assyrians of the Urmia region were among the most unfortunate elements. Already in September of 1914, before World War I started, more than 30 Assyrian villages were scorched. Russian military archives have plenty of files with documents on Assyrians of this region during this period of the time, proving the atrocities of these people. The most brutal slaughters of the thousands of Assyrians were perpetrated. The unexpected retreat of the Russian army from Urmia in January 1915 had further tragic consequences for Assyrians living in Iran. Turkish troops, along with Kurdish detachments, organized mass slaughters of Assyrian population. Only 25,000 people managed to escape death and take refuge to Transcaucasia. In January 1915, a platoon headed by Kachali Khan encircled and destroyed the largest and richest Assyrian village in Urmia, Gulpashan, where 300 Assyrian families, 2,500 people lived. All but a couple of hundred Assyrians were killed. In the village of Khosroeva, the Assyrian population, by the way, my grandfather comes from that village, and that's why my last name is Khosroeva. And he was also one of those 25,000 who had a refuge to Transcaucasia. So in the village of Khosroeva, the Assyrian population, which included refugees from neighboring villages, about 7,000 people, was gathered and slaughtered. In the village of Haftavan, 750 people were beheaded, and later 5,000 Assyrian women were taken to Turkish and Kurdish households. In the village of Kanachar, 200 people were burned alive. Turks, furious about the occupation of Dilman by the Russian army in April 1915, murdered the population of 20 neighboring Assyrian villages. Several hundred Assyrian women were undressed and brought out to the central street. They were given an hour to decide whether they would change their religion or be killed. According to European eyewitness, when the ladies were informed about it, they all immediately fell to praying for strength to die, and all were martyred. So, the painful exodus from Urmia to Mesopotamia began and was accompanied by severe human losses. An English eyewitness noted, "I saw the picture of a tragic flight of an outcast nation, Assyrians." Ronald Stafford, British former administrative inspector of Iraqi Ministry of Foreign Affairs, wrote later in his memoirs that the Assyrian exodus is one of the most tragic pages of the military history. More than 17 Assyrians died on that way. Thus, the massacres and slaughters of the Assyrians, which took place at the end of the 19th century and during the First World War in the Ottoman Empire, were clearly a form of genocide. The contemporary term for any attempt to destroy a national, ethnic, or religious group in whole or in a part. As we could see during the presentation, the Assyrian genocide was by no means accidental or unexpected. It logically derived from the brutal and nationalistic policy pursued by the Turkish sultans and later by the Young Turks against the non-Turkish nation during the preceding decades. It was not a policy of individuals, but an official state policy, which included persecution and carnage. The testimonies of the United States Ambassador Morgenthau and consuls are of a great importance in order to substantiate the genocide of the Christian population in the Ottoman state, where as the narrations of the survivors and the wiping of geographical and historic presence of Christian populations from their country are the proof that the crime of genocide has been committed. There has been a systematic procedure of slaughter which slanted by the disarmament and the massive killing of the Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks who had been enlisted the Turkish army, extermination of leaders, arrest and slaughters of the physically able male. In some regions, the civilians were slaughtered immediately and bluntly. In others, the transfer of civilians looked like a time banishment, and there were some possibilities of rescuing only of somebody embraced by Islam. However, the general form of slaughtering and banishment, as well as the systematic elimination from their places they lived, are the evidence of the existence of intention for the genocide. According to Hannibal Travis, professor of law at Florida International University, as in other recognized genocides, the Ottomans and their local allies, the Kurds and Persians, demonstrated a pattern of deliberate and systematic targeting of Christians, such as including Assyrians, for murder, maiming, enslavement, rape, dispossession, impoverishment, and cultural and ethnic discussion. Nevertheless, government and historians have not been as willing to recognize the Assyrian experience during and after World War I as a form of genocide, or even to acknowledge the existence and criminality of the Ottoman atrocities against Assyrians. According to Professor David Gant, the Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Syriac victims were easily to single out because they belonged to a non-Muslim group and spoke non-Turkic languages. They were fast targeted for violent ethnic cleansing as religious and ethnic groups, but not as racial groups. Thus, the reason for their extermination should be sought against the background of their religion and ethnic deviation from the political standard held by the ideologies in power. So before jumping to conclusion, very quickly, I'm going to give the number of Assyrian victims during the genocide. In November of 1916, the New York Times published an article by Dr. William Rockwell entitled "The Total Number of Armenians and Assyrians Dead," in which the author noted, "The Armenians are not the only unfortunates. The Assyrians also have been decimated. Great numbers have perished, but no one knows how many." This was in 1916, where crime still was going. Another American periodical, again the same time, the Atlantic Monthly, wrote, "Within 6 months, they, Young Turks, succeeded in doing what old Turks were unable to accomplish in 6 centuries. Thousands of Nestorians and Syrians vanished from the face of the earth." In November of 1919, the periodical French Asia wrote that the Assyrian slaughters resembled the Armenian massacres. And as about this nation, which had 250,000 victims, has been spoken much less, it is necessary to inform the world about it. In material prepared in 1920 by an Assyrian delegation to the Peace Paris Conference, the number of killed during the war was estimated as 250,000 too. At renewed peace negotiation in Lausanne Conference in 1923, account was 275,000. Having seen some of the primary lists used by the delegation, I observed that the several Assyrian enclaves that were located inside areas with much larger Armenian majority, so that's why they were missing. It is likely that the number of victims is higher as they were slaughtered at the same time and manner as the Armenian neighbors. Van and Diyarbakir provinces had the highest number of victims with 80,000 and 63,000 killed respectively. Going to more detailed, I can say the Syrian Orthodox Church gave 90,313 believers they were killed, including 154 priests and 7 bishops, and destruction of 156 churches. The Chaldeans reported the loss of 6 bishops, 50 priests, and 55,000 people in faithful. Nestorians, they didn't give numbers because, I mean, they were the main denomination who were killed, and next they went to diaspora. The Assyrians themselves have estimated that they lost like 2/3 of their people during the First World War. So in conclusion, I'm done. Where do we stand after more than a century since the state-orchestrated massacres and deportations happened to my people? Nowadays, when a modern Turkish historiography and the ruling political circles categorically denied the genocide over Armenians, it similarly cannot accept the genocide over Assyrians or Greeks. The Assyrian genocide is still an open wound for its people, an unfinished chapter in world history, for the guilty party has yet to receive the punishment it deserves. I thank you so much for your time, and I'm sorry if I was like, I'm out of time, or thank you so much. Oh. Reminder that we need to reconvene at Arizona Ballroom to attend the blog Holocaust by Bullets and I Choose for Please go ahead.
Freedom, you can answer whatever you want. How's that? So first of all, I did want to thank the organizers of Genocide Awareness Week for foregrounding the Assyrian Genocide, which is often not put at the center of genocide studies programs, and it's really overdue. So thank you. We had a great speaker yesterday, Sabri Atman, and now Anahit. So my first question is, what about the Assyrian aspect of the 1915 and 1894-96 genocides offers the most new and important lesson or idea to the field of genocide studies? So that's number one. To what extent do primary eyewitness accounts, and you started to talk about this at the end, such as the thousands of primary source documents in the US archives, hide Assyrian victims under the term Christian that is too often read as Armenian only? Third, are there estimates of how many Turks today have an Assyrian grandmother, great-grandmother, or other ancestor taken in the 1915 genocide? And if so, are there efforts to connect with them to reclaim their Assyrian roots? What changes need to be made in the study of 1915 and 1894 cases to recognize the unity of the process against the three targeted groups, which is not well recognized now? And finally, regarding contemporary Assyrian politics, is the community unified, or do earlier differences, Chaldeans, Nestorians, and others still have relevance in the community?
Thank you so much. So now it's too many questions. I'm confused. So whatever I forget, just remind me. Henry, thank you so much. And thank you for all your support for Assyrian cause. I mean, I know what you have done, and I know how you're continuing to help us. Thank you for that. And regarding the denominations, I'm going to start from the last. Yes, we have the denominations, and they're still there. Unfortunately, it's a big problem. And every time when it is academic conferences, usually I speak about Assyrian genocide. I mean, of course, when there are eyewitnesses and there are documents which they're mentioned as an historians or Chaldeans or Syriacs, so you have to explain non-Assyrians who they are, and it's a real problem. So, but when it is like, let's say, a conference which organized by Assyrians, again, like academic conference, you always have to give like foundation based that these are the same people, but they are divided on different denominations. And it's kind of confusing because look, for Armenians, we have the same thing. We have two churches, and sometimes whoever doesn't know, even Assyrians, they ask like, is it different, like they are Orthodox and some? No, it is not. It's the same church. Just for historic circumstances, they appear to be two. So we are the same thing, but unfortunately this problem, it still goes. And whenever you speak about Assyrian genocide and you don't mention Chaldeans or Syriacs, it's really a problem. And I believe community has to work on it. I don't know how we can, but still a lot of work has to be done. Regarding the eyewitnesses, actually, I have a document, and actually I have done by myself some like interviews with people who are already, like, about a couple months ago, the lady, she was 103 years old and she passed away in Michigan. So actually I was planning to speak about it in one of the conferences last year in Kosovo, but so it never happened. Yeah, we have, like, I cannot tell it's the same with like we have a lot of accounting for Armenian genocide. Again, like we need a lot of researchers, we need people to work on this case. So unfortunately, it's not happening. Even don't go far away, in Armenian archives, we have documents. I'm by myself, I cannot go through that every time. And you know what, unfortunately, they are already old and they are disappearing. You cannot touch them. It's another problem. So it has to be done very quickly while people are still alive. And you can have an interview with them, and also the documents still you can read it. Regarding the free, I mean, of course, yeah, I start to speak about the free Assyrians, Armenians, and Greeks. In genocide studies, I mean, I'm sure you know better. Now we have like two sides, which some of them, they think like it's one genocide with 3 nations. And of course, a lot of scholars, they think they're different genocides. Personally, me, I think it was one genocide, I know we as an half Armenian, half Assyrian, now I'm talking from Armenian side. I'm not supposed to put it as a religious genocide. I know it is, but basically this is what happened to my people, Assyrians. They were killed because they were Christians. In Armenian case, it's totally different. They were rich, they were healthy, they had a lot of, I mean, it's totally different. It is gonna take time if I speak about it. Short, what else?
Oh, just what aspect of the Assyrian aspect specifically? I'm sorry. Which aspect of that of the 1915 1894 cases is particularly instructive to genocide studies in general? What can we learn that we're not learning from other cases, and that shows us how much we need to study this case?
You know what? I'm sure it is similar, as I said, with Armenian genocide. I think like I cannot put any kind of differences, but again, it's the same thing. Like before, when we were speaking about Armenian genocide, we were only focusing on during World War I or 1915. Now we are saying, and there is a Safrastian book in English, you know, like now we are saying, no, whatever happened in 19th century, at the end of 19th century, it was based for what is going to happen during World War I. So it was a like pre-genocidal process, which again considers as genocide. And for my people, Assyrians, also, we have to think about 1933 Somali massacres, which we also recount as a genocide. Like it's like out of frying pan, out of fryer out to frying pan, or different, I don't know, to a fire. Yeah, so this is what happened. Like they escaped like Ottoman Empire, they went to Iraq, like deserts of Mesopotamia, in Bakuba camps, and they had another massacre there. So it's like, and right now it was still going. Look at the ISIS, during ISIS, like starting, it's like 21st century, our people are still, it's an ongoing genocide. Unfortunately, about Assyrian genocide, there are so many like aspects to speak, you know, but when I was speaking about Assyrian genocide, every time I had to mention that our genocide is still going on, which it's different with Armenians, it's not the same, but unfortunately the situation right now in the country, it's so bad. So I'm not lucky, like two people, and not such a good fortune. So God willing, everything will be okay. Thank you so much. I thank you so much, and thank you for your time.